Well, the second economic power in the world today, China, will definitely not be a strategic client of the first economic power, the United States. So we're going to have a change in the world. We're going to go back to the world the way it used to be. The world is fundamentally anarchic. It was anarchic, is anarchic. The peace we've had for 60 or 70 years has been highly unusual, 60 or 5 years. So we're going to be in a more complex, trickier world, but a better world.
Well, Australia's always trying to find its place in this complex, tricky world. And on the economic front, we had the first indications yesterday with the national account figures that Australia's growth is slowing. What do you see the implications of that being?
Well, that's the changeover, as the Treasurer, I think, has said. You know, as the stimulus has been withdrawn, we're waiting for the kick-up. We're trying to get the pick-up to private demand and investment without a loss of output. Now, it looks like in this quarter we've had some loss of output. And this is the same problem for the United States. The United States fiscal stimulus is being withdrawn, and the great fear there is that there won't be enough private demand or investment without a further loss of output. There's not much output lost here because we've got this enormous drive out of Asia picking up our net exports. This is not the case with the United States. So for them, the loss of output is real. If the stimulus comes back and they don't get the private investment and private consumption, and it doesn't appear as though they're going to have it in the measure they need it, then we start to see an even worse situation in the US. So we just had this quarter, a little taste of what they've got big time.
On the other side of the coin, the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens gave a major speech on Monday on the challenge of prosperity. So it is truly the other side of the coin. Thanks to the mining boom and record terms of trade, we can expect 12 to 15% above the average GDP in additional national income. And he's raised this fundamental question: what should we do with that extra money? What should we do with that extra income? What do you think?
Well, I think the Governor said, and quite reasonably, that we should be saving some of it. And I think that too. And there are different ways you can save it. I noticed the Treasurer saying overnight that the government's committed to taking superannuation up to 12%. This would be perhaps the best way we could save it. That is, instead of waiting another 5 or 6 years to get to 12%, we get there quickly. Like, I think in the current scheme, the government say they'll take superannuation from 9% in 2013 in half percentage point steps to 12% in 2019. But if we were, say, taking 1% in wages each year for 3 years, we're taking 3% of wages out of cash and into savings. In other words, we'd be helping the Reserve Bank deal with demand without raising interest rates so much if 3% was taken out of cash and put into savings. This is, I think, the best opportunity we have of saving some of the benefit out of the resources boom.
Now, one of the other issues he raises, the structural adjustment issues, how best to handle the regional differences. And one of the ways that's being done in a policy sense by the Labor government is to introduce a super profits tax on the mining boom. And I'm wondering, do you agree, first of all, with the way that they're going about that?
Oh, I certainly do. Of course, you know, look, the price of iron ore was $30 a tonne, you know, 3 or 4 years ago. It's now $150 a tonne. The tonnages are rising. These assets are owned by the people. There must be some further sharing of the economic, the unseen rent, which was unseen at the time these investments were made. A reasonable sharing of some of that rent. That's what, and because we're going to see, to accommodate this boom, an enormous transfer of resources from the eastern states to Western Australia and to Queensland, there needs to be some, if you like, fiscal equalisation coming east, where for the last 60 or 70 years has gone west.
Is that how you see the mining tax? And the question is, if you do, is it big enough? Because the one that they finally settled on was a huge compromise from the original mining tax put forward by Ken Henry.
Well, I think the original one, the great problem about the original one was that they were taxing the earnings off the big mines which were written down over the years rather than have them at their market value. That was a design issue. Once that issue changed, I think the tax became, far more agreeable, reasonable, therefore sustainable. So I think the mining tax is the right way to go. I think the government's got the right balance, and it should go through. I mean, there will, if this is a secular change in our terms of trade. This is the point Governor Stevens made well the other day. If this is not a spike, it lasts for 2 years. But if it's a sea change, then of course we will have a big supply response. There'll be, the big companies like BHP and Rio, etc., will invest in it in a big way. This will necessitate resources shifting from the east to the west. This will put pressure on the traditional industries, the service economy, tourism, import replacement. So there needs to be some fiscal benefit buttressing, if you like, the economy in the east, and of course the mining tax is one of those benefits. The other benefit, of course, is a higher exchange rate, which means that people in the east, in the cities like Sydney and Melbourne, are buying things, whether it's a flat screen TV or whether it's computers or cars. They're coming in much more cheaply. In other words, the benefit is being provided to, if you like, the ordinary taxpayer receives a benefit via the exchange rate by virtue of the mining boom.
Now, one of the big issues, you've raised this with the previous Labor government, is about the narrative and whether a Labor government has actually a narrative it can sell to voters. George Megalogenis has written an essay, and he's not alone here, in which he argues that the era of real reform is over. He argues that patience, the required patience to do reform, is gone. It's been soaked up by the 24-hour media cycle, by polling, and particularly by focus group polling. Do you think he's right?
Well, I think there's too much focus group polling and too much of that, but I don't know that the era's gone. I don't think that's fair. I think, we've seen the Prime Minister as Education Minister preside over a very big change in education. We're seeing quite a lot of structural change. And as far as the government's concerned, I mean, I think the Prime Minister's getting into her stride now. I think the cabinet system is probably working better. I mean, one of the important things
That's a bit ironic. It would all work better with a minority government.
Yeah, well, I think that the way a cabinet works is that the value of the output should be greater than the common stock of the input. In other words, there's a flux in the cabinet room which makes for better policy. The ministers may arrive with their submissions, but because they all understand the game, the output, and this was certainly true in the 80s and 90s, the output's greater. If that cabinet system's working properly, then I think the government's in a position to assemble changes. And I think Julia Gillard is now getting that cabinet system working and is starting to assemble changes. As she assembles the changes, the narrative will evolve. It'll become clearer.
Do you regard, for example, I mean, I'm sure the government would say that they have a narrative. The NBN, for example, is one of the great structural changes, reforms that can be introduced to make great changes to the Australian economy. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. But there are also these big overlaying issues like climate change, like water policy, this sort of thing. These are sort of once-in-a-century issues. Hard to grapple with, but I think the government will attend to these. They'll come through them. So this is all going to matter. Down the bottom line, Tony, we're going to have to turn around the decline in trend productivity. I mean, the reason people had a 30% real increase in wages in the last 20 years is because of productivity. In the 90s, I had productivity running at 3%. 2 percentage points of the 3 went to labour, L-A-B-O-U-R, and 1 went to profits. 15 years of 2%, 30% real. So Australian working people are walking around with real increases of 30%, and their dollar is the same as an American dollar. So in world terms, the real wealth of Australian working people has risen enormously. If you look at the United States, real wages have not risen at all since 1992, and the US dollar's gone down. So an American worker's international value, if you like, has dropped markedly, where a working Australian's wealth and international value has risen markedly.
A final quick question, because a lot of these changes are going to have to be managed with the support of the Greens in the Senate. A unique position almost, and there's a kind of alliance, a loose alliance between the Labor Party and the Greens at the moment. Do you see risks in that?
Well, I think, you know, if the big parties do the big changes, the Labor Party should never concede space to the Greens. You know, minor parties always, through the proportional system, climb into the Senate and get into a bargaining position. But if you look at the big economic changes and the big environmental changes in this country, they're delivered fundamentally by the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party's got to, you know, be seen to be doing those things and getting back to those things. I mean, you know, the climate change fiasco gave the Greens a real opportunity. Before that, they were pushed out. You know, had people like Al Gore, a former US president, occupying the space. It wasn't Green groups, it was mainstream people. So I think as we move back to the mainstream, and we will, then the relative position of the Greens will change. But I wouldn't be giving them any space unnecessarily. You know, the two-party system matters to this country, and fracturing it won't be a good thing.
Paul Keating, always fascinating to talk to you. Out of time far too soon, of course. We thank you very much for coming at the end of the year to talk to us about the coming year and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tony.